So, since watching Avengers Endgame, I've heard a few comments about the act structure, specifically fans who preferred the second or third act to each other. I thought, in the vein of this channel generally, I will take a look at how the three clear acts intersect in terms of function. I've recorded a video in advance on the terms fabula and syuzhet, but if you haven't got the time to watch that 1 minute video, you should still get the idea of what I'm talking about in terms of edited chronology. Essentially, fabula and syuzhet are the difference between the long sequence of chronological events, fabula, and the edited and represented scenes, the syuzhet, which is problematic when looking at any narrative involving time travel. On the second act, it does not do what many critics have complained many recent blockbusters have done. It does not collapse after a first act setup and lead quickly and directly into a final act confrontation. Traditionally, you would have the protagonist introduced in the first act, then the protagonist introduced to the threat of the antagonist, none of which applies to a movie that is a sequel involving the same protagonist and antagonist. No, the first act here involves a reflection on the deeper character change of the protagonist as a result of the antagonist's actions, then the rapid dispatch of the antagonist. The first act is the reaction to the antagonist, with the plot turn taking us into the second act being the reaction to Scott Lang's return. The second act here, the literal and emotional, satisfying centre of the narrative, is a form of fan service that uses time travel to pay homage to the last 10 years of the MCU canon. What is clever on the part of writers McFeely and Marcus is that the heroes are planning behind the back of Thanos, spanned across those early movies, which now have a new perspective, while Thanos in turn plans behind the back of them in the past, due to the Wi-Fi bleed over of Nebula's cybernetic brain. In the first act, the movie begins outside its own fabula. That is, it technically begins in the events of the previous movie, Infinity War, with Clint Barton. We will look at how this scene with Hawkeye is the first of several setups that explain the function of the huge amount of excised fabula, that is, the excised block of chronological time. Hawkeye is an emotional inversion of Tony Stark in the 5-hour time lag, with both Thor and Hulk having their comedic punchline carried in the short, sharp shock of a long process, edited down to before and after. Tony Stark's 5 years would not be entertaining, and neither would Thor's. Hawkeye's would be an indie movie like Manchester by the Sea that turns into a bitter Taken-style action movie. Banner's 5-year journey could potentially be entertaining, but McFeely and Marcus knew they had to pay off Banner's Infinity War conflicted setup quickly and efficiently. On the emotional tone of Act 1, it's important that this movie is not self-contained. You don't need to come in with a big action hook in the first act when you are immediately following, in canon chronology, the most dramatic action in MCU history. The opening of Endgame is exactly what you would expect in a long-form narrative following a big action scene. Thor's sudden decapitation of Thanos doesn't really do much to up the pace. Having said that, I didn't at first believe the movie was at the end of its 3 hours by Cap's dance scene, as it didn't feel slow to me. Act 1 takes its time luxuriously in terms of the action scene on screen, yet at the same time cuts light speed in its 5-year time jump. As noted, we needed this time jump for Hawkeye's loss to be so massive, and inversely for Tony's family life to be a thing really cherished and terrible to lose personally. It would be different to have a Clint Barton grieving for 2 weeks, or a Tony Stark just introduced to his first child, though I've heard grumblings about the on-screen connection between the two. On Thor and his actions in the early Thanos scene, you either need time travel now or have one of the biggest movies of recent history without a major antagonist. You also have no hope of using the Infinity Stones to reverse the snap, which was a clever part of the writing on both counts. Cue another excision of fabula or chronological time in the form of Scott Lang's Holiday in the Quantum Realm. I'm not sure that it makes sense that massively slowed time versus massively accelerated time, a la that shown in relativity theory, gives Lang the idea that they can travel back through time, but hey, it's a movie. Lang's reappearance also gives us a sense of loss from the other direction, with his family believing he is also dead to the snap for 5 years. This is where we come to the universal problem of time travel as a dire threat to taking both fabula and syuzhet seriously. That is, taking any narrative event seriously if it can be so easily rewritten. The solution is that Endgame, not being self-contained, remember, does not have to mess with its own fabula, its own chronology. Scott Lang appears to suggest messing with the chronology of Avengers Infinity War. In the course of discussions with Tony, they instead decide to mess with the history of multiple other MCU canon movies, but not Endgame. Technically, yes, the idea is just to perform a time heist and replace the stones without them even noticed as gone, though in real science terms, these would be branching, ramifying alternates, all creating different futures. The Loki Tesseract scene, for instance, would manifestly change the course of not only Loki's destiny in that timeline, but also S.H.I.E.L.D. in that timeline. Captain America returning to events immediately preceding the heist would not erase that branch, which I believe is a problem with all of the multiverse storylines that have been generated by the big two publishers in recent years. Why worry about one character or universe when both are almost infinitely multiple? Despite this, unlike other time travel movies, the protagonists are not as clearly calling into question, nullifying the authenticity of their own endgame narrative, at least for the viewer. There are a few small caveats on ultimate finality, such as the previous Gamora surviving sidestepping her sacrificial soul stone scene, but Clint insisting Natasha's sacrifice can't be reversed. Possibly you could write this authentically via Doctor Strange as the second Gamora, clearly being in Strange's one special timeline, the second Gamora responsible for securing the gauntlet. But I can't see Clint working this out. He's not Strange or Tony or even Banner. Seen from the perspective of Tony as hero, we have a very traditional refusal of the call in Act 1 as we approach the inevitability of the second act. Just as Clint must throw himself full force into the challenge and trials of time travel, Tony, as the family inverse, has one of the most powerful reasons for refusing the call to adventure of any hero. This powerful reason is amplified when Thanos raises the stakes by altering his master plan by no longer desiring half of all living things dead, but now desiring to destroy everything, including Tony's family, in order to rebuild it anew. This is really the ultimate payoff to Tony's warning earlier on time travel. Their wish to rewrite the snap on one half of all living things has resulted in a new Thanos hell-bent on destroying everything. Therefore, their time travel does have true consequences, significant enough to risk everything. Back to the second act, and the time-travelling team come across their own selves in New York during Avengers 1. They are cautioned beforehand not to convey information to previous selves. That is, the distinction between speech and action doesn't make much logical sense. How giving the old Tony a cardiac arrest does not mess with that timeline is anyone's guess, but there's clearly a reason we have the warning not to convey information to our old selves, which is carried through to Strange's remark to Iron Man later. And we can guess that telling Tony that he'd sacrifice himself would change events. And otherwise, on the caveat to not tell yourself something that they shouldn't know. The entire plan would be for Thor to tell old Thor to go for the head. Job done, short movie. As it is, old Cap gets beaten up by himself, and at least part of Hydra, back in Avengers 1, now believe Cap is part of Hydra. Banner talks to the Ancient One, and she gives a lecture on not messing with timelines until he informs her Doctor Strange himself handed Thanos the Time Stone. The Ancient One quickly falls in line with that one special timeline. Loki also does a Gamora and undies to live another day in Disney streaming land. Cap also gets a glimpse of Peggy Carter, which is probably a very small but necessary addition to the emotional punch of his ending. And we can also ask, did that one glimpse change his future? So, all of the time travel that did not mess with the chronology of Endgame's own story, and here I'm speaking abstractly as I've already called into question the whole temporal rewriting angle, results in a Stark engineered gauntlet complete with Infinity Stones. This can be won by only one Avenger, an intellectual conclusion that really does hammer home the emotional power of the finale and the surprise of that finale. What is really impressive here is that in this mammoth 3-hour movie, they wait what seems like only a couple of story beats to allow these heroes to enjoy their short-lived success. Hulk reverses the snap, then bam, and bam, bam bam, etc. The technology developed by Stark was absolutely not a time portal, so I'm left a little confused by a conspicuous absence of millions of pin particles for an entire army, but I'll ignore that, calling it Thanos tech. Within what feels like no time at all, they've crashed from a peak of success to the depths of defeat. Now I'll note that my entire theory on the basis of their later victory in a video recorded last year is partially contained within a single line from the returning Peter Parker, but the Russo brothers solved the entire issue of the existence of characters within an Infinity Stone in the comics by not covering it at all within the syuzhet, the narrative presented, that is. That experience, the 5 years that might feel quite differently within a Soul Stone, is completely excised from the film. Instead, they have the fabula of that experience implied by a throwaway comment in the script. So, after past Gamora and future Nebula, stop past Nebula. The gauntlet then essentially becomes a football on a huge sports field, and a huge number of characters from the MCU canon get their turn to play. All of this, and they have still not ruined the integrity of their own endgame plot with time travel. All of this, and yet the epic nature of the teamwork is wasted when Thanos destroys the van, all of that teamwork poetically being abandoned for a lone act of heroic sacrifice from a narcissistic superego, Tony Stark, with a final line which belies the huge element of self-sacrifice, "I am Iron Man." The MCU canon loop is closed with that amazing final line from Tony.